Welcome back, everybody. Derrick Soo, your 2022 Oakland mayoral candidate. Today I'm going to talk about something a little different. I'm going to do a book review. I was given this book by a relative. That relative is Bruce Quan Jr. Some of you may recognize that name because back in 2016, Bruce actually ran against Rebecca Kaplan for city council seat at large. Obviously, Bruce didn't win, but Bruce did retire. He was a civil rights attorney here in Oakland. He actually worked for a short time with Art Agnos's administration. He was a deputy district attorney, or assistant DA, assistant district attorney, and he worked as an interim attorney for the city of Alameda and also for a short while with the city of Oakland. So Bruce is well known around the Oakland and the Bay Area for being a civil rights attorney. And so we both grew up in a very interesting time. Bruce is a bit older than me. I grew up during the 60s and literally down the street from the Black Panthers in East Oakland. I literally was born and raised in East Oakland in 1960. Our first home was on the flatlands down on 64th Avenue. Then in 1966, we moved to the other end of 64th Avenue, which was up in the Oakland Hills. So we lived there until my father's passing in 2011. That's when the home was turned over. It was seized by the court to pay his medical and final expenses. And so, we lost the home. The home was paid for. There was no loans on it. Nothing was ever outstanding. It wasn't well maintained, unfortunately, so my parents didn't, or the court didn't get a whole lot of money for that. But anyway, I bring up this book because I want to talk about a lot of the atrocities that happened going all the way back to the gold rush, how us in the Chinese community, we call a lot of the Caucasian folks, it doesn't apply to everybody, but what we called the white folks was lo fan, which translated nicely is white devil. And so we were constantly battling the lo fan back in the 60s. One of the earliest memories that I had of racism and redlining and districting to keep nationalities and races out of an area was the city of Piedmont. And it's a real interesting history going back to the city of Piedmont. City of Piedmont was actually created in 1907, and it was created because the actual hatred of the wealthy lo fan. The city of Piedmont was created because of my great-grandfather Liu Hing. Liu Hing was bringing the Chinese and the folks of color into Oakland and supporting them. Chinatown really took off at that time. I have some history about Chinatown and also of the cannery that my great-grandfather was at one time the third largest canning business on the entire West Coast. Back then he was competing against the likes of Del Monte and Libby Foods, which were also large canneries in the area. And so he competed as the first Chinese industrialist. He's actually listed as the first Chinese industrialist at a time when it was truly illegal because of the 1882 Chinese Exclusionary Act. So going back to that limited immigration to America to Asian men only, and women were turned back to go back to China. Women were not allowed to immigrate here. So that was one of the lo fan's way to encourage the Chinese men to go back home. go back to where you come from. And it's funny because I read some of the things, and nowadays we're hearing of, because of COVID and the way that this particular presidency has treated folks of Asian descent, that we see a lot of violence being placed upon the Asian population. And what this is just a rehash of the old days. We, the Chinese and the Asian population, we were always demonized. I'll read some of the hurtful things that they referred to us as. Let's see. Okay. In the 1800s, late 1800s, we were referred to as sneaky Oriental, yellow peril, Chinese menace, indispensable enemy, and we were referred to as a filthy nest of inquiry and rottenness by the Lofan. That was San Francisco back in the day, and we hear a lot of that same rhetoric going on these days, to the Asian culture. And then now, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was very common. Chinese, Asian people were murdered for no reason, killed for no reason. Then we were beat up, robbed of our stuff, and so there were a lot of atrocities on our family. 5 generations here in America currently, and so a lot of these things that are in this book are also the same tactics being used against all people of color. And so this is a very interesting book, because you can read about history, how difficult it was for the Chinese to come and assimilate to this country. My great-grandfather was one of the few people who were able to make breakthroughs, even though everything collapsed at the end, but there's still the history, and it's a very rich history here in Oakland. I plan on continuing that history, but I would encourage you to pick up this book, read through it. There's so many similarities that go on these days. I read the entire book, and it brought back so many memories. I remember I was always a smaller than usual kid, and the Lofan kids in the area would throw rocks at me, throw bottles at me for no reason. I didn't understand why, and they called me all sorts of names. I mean, very hurtful names, and I heard that all through elementary school, and it wasn't until junior high school that stopped, and I put a stop to that because of my martial arts, and so that helped out a lot, and that made a difference. It was changing the culture, and those that I ended up using some martial arts on all became my friends. So it was real interesting. Things change, and so we hope that we can do the same thing, where we can get some changes. And here in Oakland, I plan on changing the culture of our police department. I have a plan. I'm going to start talking about it shortly. I'm already going to start approaching certain key people, and we're going to discuss this. So anyway, there are plans to change the culture of OPD and the way things run here in Oakland, because again, it's just a playbook out of here, what Oakland's been doing the last 20 years to Oakland on all the mismanagement that's been going on. We have solutions, and then we have administrators who don't want to listen to the solutions, and then the solutions that I brought up to some city council people, I got laughed at. They laughed in my face and said, no, we're not going to do that. They didn't even ask any questions as to how it could work, what would it cost, things like that. So these are things that have to be changed. Otherwise, what we have is the continuation of the status quo, and that's why you folks here in Oakland have voted for change. And you voted for change with my friend Carol Fife of District 3. I've always supported Carol, and I still support her in her council seat. Yeah, and we want to make change. And Oakland certainly needs change, because it's certainly been going in the wrong direction, and so that's going to change. Thanks for joining me today. We'll be right back.